Hi, and welcome to California on the Ballot. I'm Julie Fry, President and CEO of California Humanities. This afternoon's edition is hosted with KALW Public Radio, an NPR station in the San Francisco's Bay Area, and it's an inquiry about the 70.8%. What explains California's voter turnout? California Humanities is a statewide nonprofit organization focused on connecting the people of California through the public humanities, grant making, and delivering programs that help us learn together about our histories, cultures, and experiences. The California on the Ballot initiative is funded by the Mellon Foundation through the Federation of State Humanities Councils. And as you can see on the screen, we've done several programs, and we have some additional programs that will be happening through the month of April, and we hope you'll be able to join us. For today's program, our moderator is Sonia Narang, a journalist at KALW, and she managed their elections coverage and heads up their health and equity journalism project. Over the past decade, Sonia reported social justice stories around the globe for PRI's The World Radio program, which is pretty fun to say that. So I'd like to thank Sonia, KALW, and our esteemed panel of experts for joining us today. Sonia, over to you.
Well, thank you so much for having me, and it's really an honor to moderate this panel of fantastic speakers from around California, my home state. I'd like to introduce everyone, starting with Jane Junn. Jane is a professor of political science and an author. She's based at the University of Southern California in Los Angeles, where I'm sitting right now, and she also focuses on Asian American voters and gender issues. Hi, Jane.
Hi, great. Great to be here. Thanks for having me.
Thank you. We also have Eric McGhee. Eric is a senior fellow at the Public Policy Institute of California.
Thank you for having me.
Next, I'll move on to Francisco Pedraza. He is a political scientist at the University of California, Riverside. Hi, Francisco.
Hello, great to join everybody.
Thanks for being here. We also have Shakirah Simley. Shakirah is the director of the San Francisco Office of Racial Equity and a friend of KALW. Nice to see you here, Shakirah.
Thanks for having me, Sonia. Nice to be here.
Thank you. And last but not least, we have Veronica Terriquez. She is an associate professor who is about to join UCLA's Chicano and Central American Studies and Urban Planning departments this fall. Nice to have you with us, Veronica.
Thank you for having me.
Well, thanks to all of you for being here to talk about voter turnout in California. You know, we want to start the conversation today with looking at some of the major forces that drive voter registration around the state. Also, we'd like to look at voter eligibility and abstention in California. What are some of the reasons that people have not been able to vote? We also want to look at some of the spikes and dips in voter turnout across the years. So I'd like to start with Eric. As a researcher at the Public Policy Institute of California, PPIC, you've done a lot of work looking at these trends. So can you start by commenting on what you've seen so far?
Well, so California has, compared to the rest of the country, tends to have somewhat lower turnout overall. The big problem for California has always been registration. That is, people don't tend to register at quite the same rates as they do in other countries. And even though registration has grown over time in California, it hasn't grown as fast as it has in other states. A big part of that divide is communities of color in California who don't register at the same rates as their non-Hispanic white counterparts. And so really trying to address that piece of the puzzle is one of the most important things that we can be doing here in California. I think also it's important to keep in mind in California, when you're talking about California specifically, that we do have an extremely diverse population that is not reflected in the community of people who vote. That's not as much of an issue in a place like North Dakota, for instance. But it is a huge part of what we're concerned about in California and what we've been trying to address as a state. I will say some of this stuff is a little bit in flux because the state has seen a tremendous increase in its voter registration over just the last few years. There have been a number of reforms that we can talk about more as this event goes on. There's been a number of reforms that have really expanded the electorate in ways that we haven't seen probably in the history of the state. That said, it's not clear yet whether that has closed that participation gap that's really kind of ought to be our main focus of concern.
Right. Yeah. Well, thanks for bringing that up, Eric. In fact, just yesterday, the Center for Inclusive Democracy at USC released a study that found this participation gap still persists for historically underrepresented groups of voters. And despite seeing higher turnouts in 2020, unfortunately, California found that the Latinx population, Asian Americans, and youth did not make as much headway in closing that gap between their turnout rates and California's overall turnout. And we're going to come to that throughout this conversation. I'd like to hear from Jane. Jane, you've mentioned in your work that there have been many structural constraints that have limited access to voting and have led to voter abstention. We're also going to talk to Shakirah about that. But Jane, can you offer your insights on why this has happened?
Yeah, sure. And I think Shakirah is going to talk about these mainly within the context of contemporary politics coming next and what are these continuous barriers to registration and to voting. But I want to make a couple of points, three in particular, and just shift away a little bit away from what Eric was talking about. Eric was making the comparison to other states. And I think this is a useful one, but I think it's also useful to think about a specific example. So let's say, California is a highly diverse state. Let's just say that we were looking at Alabama in 1960. What do you think the turnout and registration rate there would be? Pretty high, right? And who was enfranchised to vote in Alabama during that period? Only whites basically were enfranchised as a function of restrictive measures against African American voters. And so I think when we consider, the state of California versus others, we have to think, as Eric noted, very carefully about who's in the population and how recently they have come into these locations, not only as voters, but also as citizens. So with this, I guess what I want to focus on a little bit is for us to think about the change over the long term. So instead of comparing California to other states, let's look at California over time and what has changed and why that has changed. So in a few minutes, I guess we'll be looking at a graphic, but at the same time, I'd like you to think carefully. All of us, if we think about, just say from the last 100 years, what happened 100 years ago? Well, something very significant to voting happened 100 years ago. Women were finally, by constitutional amendment, given the right to vote. And you'll see a big jump in eligible turnout among eligible voters then. But keep in mind also that this is roughly half the population of voters who were restricted, not necessarily in all states, but in most states as a function of laws that defined voters as men, as property holders, as whites, for example. And so I think it's important to consider not only the structural constraints around who was excluded, but to consider the historical record that until fairly recently, and I'm going to say in the last 5 years, and maybe a little bit before that, when Shelby County was decided by the United States Supreme Court, authored by John Roberts, which is to say, took away the protections of the Voting Rights Act, Section 4 and 5. We can talk about that in detail. But in general, over the course of the 20th century, there's been an increase in the right to vote. We are now seeing rollbacks to that, not only with respect to Supreme Court decisions such as Shelby County, but also with respect to states across the nation, Georgia, Texas, Arizona, finding ways to disenfranchise voters. But in the 40 and 50 years prior to that, we had periods of time such as the Voting Rights Act, 1965, the Section 203 of the Voting Rights Act, which provides rights to language minorities that have in essence increased the denominator. So in other words, the number of people who are allowed to vote. The numerator, that's what a lot of people have focused on, like, why won't these people go out and vote? Why won't they register? I challenge us to think not only about those questions and not make it an issue about something's wrong with these individual voters. Why don't they vote at the same rate that white people do? But instead, think about what are the structural disadvantages? What are the barriers to registration, to voting, to being involved, to getting mobilized by a party. So those are the things I want to talk about that we need to consider in relative terms over time, not only across states, that we need to think about structures that have limited us and that are still available to be limited. I think all we need to do is look across Republican-run legislatures across the United States and see major moves to the reduction in voting rights as a function of, in many cases, demographic traits.
Right. Those are all very critical points. And I'm glad that you bring them up at the beginning of this conversation, Jane. We're going to be talking to Shakirah and Francisco and Veronica about those issues as well. Before we do, I would like to show a graphic, one that you just alluded to, Jane. And here you're going to see California's turnout history in presidential election years. So this is a line graph with data collected from California's Secretary of State Election Division. And we're looking at turnout and eligibility from 1910 to 2020. So as you can see, we saw some of those spikes in the 60s, as you mentioned, and then we saw a more recent spike this past year in 2020. But issues of access to voting is really important to consider. So next I'd like to speak about within California's population, who is and who isn't voting. Why are people not able to vote? What are some of those systemic issues of access? So Shakirah, we'd like to start with you. I know you spent a lot of time looking at these kinds of systemic barriers to voting, access to public transit, access to an address, to a secure address that you can use to register. Can you elaborate on those barriers people have faced?
Thank you so much. I want to commend Jane for providing that history lesson, that necessary history lesson to ask better questions. So we're not stigmatizing vulnerable communities, communities of color, immigrants, and our diverse California communities as to why folks are not showing up to the ballot box. I don't think the question is, when we're talking about changing behavior, it's not about talking about individuals. It is talking about systems and structures. As a person that works within government, that's extremely important to me, which is why the city and county of San Francisco worked extremely hard during this past general election to make sure that we're breaking barriers from everyone from our homebound seniors to our multilingual communities to our native Black communities and neighborhoods, to making sure that we're asking those better questions about access, right? So for example, if 40% of our African-American, 40% of our unhoused population is African-American, what does that mean for the Black vote in the city, right? If there are fears within our mixed status and immigrant families about showing up under a federal administration they were targeted for 4 years, what does that mean to show up at the ballot box and how they are represented? Let's look at neighborhoods. If you don't have access to public transportation, a post office, a ballot box, or it's not safe to walk outside in a pandemic, what does that mean for you getting your voice heard? If we think about other, more particular issues as far as understanding what's on the ballot itself and how confusing that is for many folks. And I also want to say voting is not the only way in which communities of color are engaged in civics and where people value where their voices are heard. It may not be at the ballot box, but it might be at school board meetings, at their local, creating mutual aid societies to make sure folks are fed in this pandemic and how folks have really shown up for each other. So I think we need to make sure we're broadening our understanding of civic and democratic participation, particularly for our most vulnerable communities, and center their wisdom and expertise on knowing that they know how to take care for themselves when traditionally they have not been represented within traditional forms of political leadership. So I think that's extremely important to talk about and to center. But I also want to make sure that if we're thinking about voting in California, it's how are we working as individuals? How are we working collectively? And how are we working as institutions to break down any sort of structural impedance that would not allow folks to vote, right? Is that automatic registration? Is it making sure that that's multilingual? If we have promotores for health, can we have that for voting? Is it making it more seamless and going where people already are when it comes to thinking about neighborhood or community hubs and folks who are already doing the work. And what are our engagement strategies, right? And how are we lifting those up to make sure that folks are getting messages from people that they trust and that actually care about them. I could talk about this until I'm blue in the face, but I would love to hear from our fellow panelists. But yes, you know, as a person who is always delving deep in thinking about racial equity, we have to think about systems and structures and start there first. So we're not stigmatizing folks for not showing up where they may be, but not in a way that we expect them to when it comes to comparisons to their white counterparts.
Exactly. And those are really important points that you've made. And, you know, I think that it is important to look at how people who may not vote are super engaged civically within their own communities in other ways, even if they aren't voting or have access to polling places. And, you know, we want to talk to Francisco about some of the research that he's done looking at first-time voters. You know, Francisco, I know you've spent a lot of time studying rural voters in agricultural areas across the state, you know, especially since you're in Riverside, you know, and you've looked at also non-English language communities, which are especially essential to consider when we're looking at California's population. And we just want to share a visual on the screen before we get to your answer, Francisco, to show the audience here. We have a map of California. This is a heat map where you're seeing red indicating counties that have fewer voters. This is in the 2020 election, also data collected from the Secretary of State Election Division. And the blue is showing counties with greater voters. So, you know, as we talk to you, Francisco, you know, the work that you've done researching first-time voters, also farm workers, can you explain what you've seen with their experiences and their registration numbers in recent years, and how have people been able to reach them and increase voter participation in those areas, in those communities?
Sure, I want to highlight just a couple of things. I'll start out by saying that this is a great map, and it's an example of a map that a number of political operatives would look at. Not just those who are really interested in mobilizing low propensity voters, but even political operatives who just want to get candidates elected. And one of the things that they might be taking into consideration as they're thinking about how to allocate resources towards the goal of electing their particular candidate is they think to themselves, well, gosh, I'm going to get the most bang for my buck if I put operations and plans in place that take into consideration where population's concentrated, and also think about who is most likely to turn out. And on that basis, a whole lot of resources get funneled outside of those areas that are red and into those areas that you've highlighted as blue. That really presents a tricky, a dilemma, you might say here. How do we get individuals who are low propensity voters or first-time voters to turn out if no one's investing? So I really, really appreciate the comments that we've heard so far that invite us to think about the structural and systemic factors that lead to the turnout map that you're showing here looking the way that it does. With that in mind, I would like to highlight two things. The first is that those political operatives that help candidates get elected, especially those from the two major political parties, they're trafficking in millions and millions, and in some cases, billions of dollars. Those are the operations that they have to play with. The folks who are really focused on getting those areas in the middle of California, intercoastal regions, those that are highlighted right now in pink and deep red, a lot of the leadership and a lot of what we know about what works to mobilize, say, farm workers, immigrant proximate communities, those are folks who I think it's fair to say are in it for the long haul. They're not there just during election cycles. They're there as trusted community anchor organizations, much like Shakirah alluded to earlier. They have relationships that they have built up and invested, and that, it turns out, has been really good. It's been paying off for a whole host of other issues, but it also means that it takes a lot of time. It takes a tremendous amount of person and people power that's patient, that follows up, that is consistent, and that's hard to square sometimes with the goals that are fundamentally sorted and oriented and organized along election cycles. So that's one thing. The second thing that I would do is I'd further lift this up a little bit and just remind anyone in the audience who is connected to foundations and has an appetite for supporting that kind of work. I would invite you to think really carefully about how you might sponsor or support the efforts that specific community organizations are engaging in. I took a long, hard look this past summer at some of the organizations like the Filipino Advocates for Justice Organization, the Hmong Innovating Politics, Coalition for Humane Immigrant Rights, Alianza in Coachella Valley, the Youth Mentoring Action Network. And these are the exact kinds of civic organizations that day in and day out are working very closely with first-time and low-propensity voters, and quite frankly, have a nice blueprint in place for how they might use resources to not just build up a voter portfolio, right, for individuals, but also a bigger civic participation portfolio.
And you make a really good point, is that this work can take a lot of time. You may not see it reflected in the next election, but you could see it within the next decade. And it's interesting how you point to various regions in that map and local groups that have worked with certain multicultural communities. And this is work that takes time. We're going to be talking to Veronica about how youth work and mobilizing young people, especially through peer-to-peer, can also take time, but then have bigger payoffs later. And before we move into this conversation about young voters, we would love to hear from some youth around the state of California. We collected some voices from young voters in different cities, from San Diego all the way up to the Bay Area, about why they did and didn't vote. So for the next couple of minutes here, we'd like to present these voices to our audience.
Hello, my name is Daisy McGhee, and I am from the Inland Empire area, which is around San Bernardino. My first time voting was in 2016 when I turned 18. A lot of friends and family are not documented, so I like being able to be a voice for my community. I like being able to vote for those who cannot vote. There's a lot of things that I cannot do, but if there's one thing that I can do, and if I do have the privilege of voting, why not take it?
My name is Katrina King. I live in San Diego, California. I actually sat out on the first election I could have voted in, which was the 2008 presidential election. I realized that I didn't know enough about my own political beliefs to make confident voting decisions. So I didn't feel comfortable with voting. And as an 18-year-old, I didn't realize how much I would actually be affected by the election results.
My name is Lena Potts. I'm the unit director for the Boys and Girls Club here in East Palo Alto, California. So I voted for the first time in the 2012 presidential election. It was the
I'm not sure if you could hear the entire thing. I actually have a copy of it on my computer that I can try to play. So let's try that route since we want to hear the very tail end, because we have a guy in there too. We want to skip him. So let me see if I can pull up my audio. Sorry about that, but I have it right here. Let me just pick up with Lena Potts in East Palo Alto.
And presidential elections are flashy, but a lot related to because I had, always been relatively convinced of the power of civic engagement. I know that national elections and presidential elections are flashy, but a lot of this country is made from local elections and local issues.
My name is Jude Gonzalez. I am 20 years old. My first experience in voting was during the 2020 presidential elections. It was less about being nervous about voting, but more trying to feel my obligation as a minority within my community to vote for those that are not able to vote.
So thanks for listening. Sorry about our technical difficulties. But this takes us to Veronica. We heard from Veronica this week on KALW. Thanks for sharing your insights on the youth vote. And I want to find out, what are some of the initiatives you've seen in recent years to lower the voting age? You've done a lot of research also on how to get youth engaged and excited about voting. I'm particularly excited about the peer-to-peer strategy. So I'd love for you to talk about that. And, you know, why have we waited for so long to let young people vote?
Well, thank you for the question. One of the things that's really exciting about California is that we allow for pre-registration of 16 and 17-year-olds. And this has contributed to the increase in turnout among young people, because I believe without this, they would have been left behind even more. And so since 2016, there's been groups of grassroots youth organizing groups, as well as more informal groups doing nonpartisan voter registration at local high schools that have educated young people, or who have engaged in discussion with young people about why their voice matters. And part of this process is educating young people, or having a discussion about voting rights and the history of voting rights and how different groups have been disenfranchised. And that history is motivating because it helps contextualize why it is that one's vote can matter, especially locally. So part of the voter education that's been done by groups like Power California and their affiliate organizations is providing information about local turnout and the history of turnout among young people and how it has historically lacked, but has so much potential to influence the outcome of elections. Today's millennials and Generation Z are a very large population, and they potentially can exercise a lot more political power, and raising that awareness is motivating. And a lot of this education has been done peer-to-peer. High school students are educating other high school students, or sometimes it's 19 or 20-year-olds, and the local messenger matters, as Shakirah was alluding to earlier. Having somebody that looks like you, that talks like you, explain why it's important to vote in your particular community can be exciting and motivating. And I also have noted that the nonpartisan messaging really helps, because young people feel like they're being bombarded by all this advertising, but just the ABCs of how to fill out the registration form properly, when and how to go to the polls, when they're open, what are your options? It's just basic information that young people are really searching for. And I also want to lift up some or piggyback on what Francisco said about large, Democratic or Republican campaigns focusing their energy on those densely populated areas and high propensity voters. What I've seen is that very few groups are trying to reach out to young people. And I think that there's a lot of power in investing in local youth organizations where it's young people saying, hi, I'm from your community, and this is why I'm voting. As an undocumented person or as a 15-year-old, I want you to vote on my behalf. So I think there's a lot of potential in building up these localized grassroots organizations to also partner with local school districts in doing this voter outreach. So in Los Angeles County, where I've seen the greatest integration between nonpartisan groups and high school districts, we've seen voter registration rates and voter turnout rates grow more than in other places.
Yeah, that's really important, like you said, for people to hear from their peers about why this is important. Last election season, I got to participate in the RISE Youth Center's young people Ballot Zoom conference. And these were 16, 17, 18-year-olds that were so excited because someone who looked like them, who had the same experiences as them, was explaining to them why it was so important to vote. And many of them were actually volunteering as phone bankers. And these are teenagers who were excited because they could hear from their own, friends and engaged colleagues who were also their age. You know, I also want to talk to Eric, who has written a lot about youth for the Public Policy Institute of California. You know, one thing you've looked at is that, you know, young registered voters will turn out at higher rates, but then you're finding that they will drop off in subsequent elections. Can you talk about why some of this happens?
Yeah, well, I mean, I think it goes back to some of the things people have been talking about here, trying to find, well, first of all, young people move around a lot. So they often don't know where their polling place is. They don't know kind of what's going on in their community necessarily. You know, that mobility really creates a sense of instability that makes it harder to engage with the political process. You know, having these mobilization efforts, I think, is critically important. And again, like as so many people have said here, having that mobilization be with trusted messengers, with people that are aware of your community, that can speak to things that matter to you, right? As a young person, what's going on in your local area, all those things are incredibly important. We also found in our research that young people who registered as vote by mail were actually more likely to follow up in subsequent elections, which I think gets to this point of that instability of moving around and not knowing quite where your polling place was. So if you're a precinct voter and you move to a new place, you might not be aware of sort of what the steps are to go to vote the next time around, right? If you're getting a ballot in the mail, it makes it just a little bit easier to know sort of what you need to do next and to kind of follow up in future elections.
Right. Veronica, also, can you talk a little bit about some of the recent initiatives to lower the voting age, particularly a prop that was on the ballot this past election for California, but was defeated? Why did that happen?
So Proposition 18 was on the ballot this last fall, and it was an initiative that would have allowed 17-year-olds to vote if they were old enough, 17-year-olds to vote in the primary election if they were old enough to then turn 18 by the time the general election came around. And California voters voted against it. And I think the assumption is that 17-year-olds are not smart enough or competent enough to vote. And so, or I think there's also a concern that teachers might influence students on how to vote. And I think that this way of thinking about 17 years old does not give them credit to their intelligence and their capacity to make informed decisions. And so I think it was a missed opportunity for the California electorate to really invest in young people, and also for schools to kind of think about the opportunity to provide nonpartisan voter education, particularly for high school seniors. There's plenty of studies that show that nonpartisan voter education at the high school level could really excite young voters and could really promote their long-term engagement in electoral politics.
Yeah, we're going to come to that issue later, is, you know, how young voters, including young voters of color, can help to shape California's future. And that's something that, you know, a lot of people have looked at, and something that, you know, I'd like to bring up. And, you know, before we get to that, I also want to bring Jane into the conversation. You know, another major group that people have looked at in elections is women. And, you know, one of your focus areas is gender. And, you know, I want to find out from you, you mentioned that women have heavily populated the pool of voters in the US for decades. And how are you seeing that play out in California? How are you seeing more women in the registered voters? Is that also shaping how things turn out at the polls?
Well, it certainly is. I mean, if I asked all of you, just the panelists here, but everybody else who's listening, who's the modal voter in American politics? So by that, are there more women or are there more men in the American electorate today? Francisco says women. That is correct. That's also true for California. What about 1964? Who was the modal voter in 1964? And you're like, well, if you're asking me that, it's got to be women. And you would be right. It was women also in 1964. So you can look as far back. If you look at that earlier line chart that Sonia had up, there's a big jump in 1920, following 1920. And that is probably the result of the entrance of women into the electorate following the ratification of the 19th Amendment. But it's still true. It is still the case among all groups of voters in California by race. That is true. There are more women in the electorate by each group. So whites are 51%. 51% of white voters who are likely voters. This is PPIC data, courtesy of Eric's organization. PPIC data was 51% of white voters are female. 53% of Latinx voters are female. 61% of African-American voters are female. And the only group that diverges is Asian Americans, which has more men than women in the electorate at present. And that's probably because of the high immigration status of these groups and the longer time, but the higher likelihood that it's men who are coming on H-1B visas and then getting citizenship first. That's probably the reason for it. But overall, women are more democratic than men, which is also what's driving national electoral outcomes. At the same time, that is not true by race. And as you all probably know by now, white women do not vote Democratic. You know that, right? So between 1952 and 2020, all those 19 elections, how many of them did white women support by a majority Democratic candidates? I mean, did white women support Trump or Biden in 20? Trump. In 16, Trump. So there are only two actual presidential elections in which white women have supported Democrats, and that's William Jefferson Clinton and LBJ, two Southern men. Go figure. My point here is that women are the most important voter. They're the modal voter in American politics. They're most likely to be a swing voter, but that one has to look very carefully at the data and disaggregate by race, because if you think all women are Democrats, you'd be wrong. The gender gap is driven not by all women, it's driven by women of color, because women of color are so heavily disproportionately Democratic that they only make white women look like they're Democratic. White women are not. They're almost always consistently around low to mid 50s in support of Republican candidates. That is true across the board for presidential candidates as well as members of Congress. And it's why you see all the red areas in the center of the state. I don't mean just in the heat map, but all the red areas. They're overwhelmingly driven by white female voters.
Those are really interesting points. Another great history lesson from Jane. You know, it's really important to know this as we get into conversations of contemporary voters. And you know, this past election, we saw that the number of registered voters skyrocketed. That's something that we based this discussion around. You know, I'd like to look more specifically at which groups you found registered in larger numbers and whether these increases made our voter rolls more representative of California's diverse population. So I'd like to start with Shakirah. You know, are you finding that with newer voters, we can expect to see changes in future elections if we have more diverse voters in the electorate?
I think what we're seeing is not only would we start seeing changes in the electorate, which is very exciting, there's also engagement that happens in between elections. So, like for example, you see folks like one of our young people on the in the interview talked about local elections. Well, a lot of the fever pitch around things like, you know, defunding the police or asking better questions around city budgets in general, or getting in, you know, when millennials have children, getting engaged in the school board. I mean, those are the sorts of like in between times that we see this electorate is starting to ask questions about, want to learn more about, understand who represents them. And I think not only are you seeing changes in the electorate, but you'll see changes in elected officials, right? So every year we get closer to seeing more and more women, you know, more folks from our LGBTIQIA community, more folks with disabilities and different types of communities actually being elected into office. So you kind of need both sides. You need the electorate shifting, but you also need that representation shifting as well, so that decision making, because we do live in a representative democracy, is better shared and more participatory, which I think is really exciting. So yes, I think with more folks registering, more diverse communities being engaged is hopeful. But I think the real change that we'll see is the shifting is the in-between times between general elections that are really exciting and can shift policy much more quickly.
Mm. Yeah, and the recent report that was released that I mentioned earlier from USC Center for Inclusive Democracy looked at the Latinx population as well. And I want to bring this to Francisco. They found that the percentage of Latinx voters increased from about 23 to 24%. It was a positive uptick, but still below the state's eligible voter population of about 31%. So Francisco, can you elaborate on, what an increased number of Latinx voters will mean for California and how to continue to reach those voters?
Sure, I'll answer those questions and then I'll raise you one additional thought.
Sure.
So I think that the impact will certainly be felt. The more that you have in terms of a voice from a particular community, the more input literally that makes into policy and decision-making processes. And by the way, I want to second something that Shakirah pointed out, that in between election cycles is so crucial, because in addition to boosting people's civic literacy and participation rates, it also increases the probability that people will take an additional step and become involved in actual election office holding, right? So they'll take leadership roles. And that is so crucial. There's a lot of research that documents how we respond to exemplars and models. And when we have more and more leaders reflecting the general population, that's synergistic, right? These things don't happen in a vacuum. And you'll get more and more, especially those youth voters, looking at the upper echelons of leadership and believing, just as we saw a couple of months ago, that you can be a racial and ethnic minority candidate and make it to the highest offices in the land. And that is a crucial and really powerful message that for a lot of generations, right, like didn't exist. But we're starting to see a tremendous shift. I wanted to also comment on one other sort of thought related to this, and that's that the number of registered voters tells us only one piece of the puzzle. We're also not necessarily going to see that translate into participation for some of the same reasons that Jane brought up earlier, right? That these structural impediments mean that individuals who are still mired in low-wage jobs, that have to think really carefully about how they're going to organize their week and weekends to survive from one month to the next. Political participation can become, in some cases, not in all, but in some cases, can become a luxury they can't afford. Now, we've also got lots of interesting and fantastic research that says political participation is something they can't afford not to engage in. But there's no doubt that having to choose how you spend your time, do you take that extra shift so that you can make ends meet? Or do you spend some time becoming familiar with the ballot, for example, or thinking carefully about how you can be involved in other forms of civic participation? Is a real tough choice.
Yeah, those are all very important points. And it's really great to consider how people can get involved in other ways, and how you're seeing more candidates, more people running for office from these traditionally underrepresented groups as well. I'd also like to open it up to the rest of the panel. How are you seeing, young voters or adult voters from other backgrounds that are making an impact now in voting, and by being politically engaged? What are some of the, some of the ways which they're shaping California politics today? Veronica, would you like to speak about, you've looked at youth in communities of color. Can you talk about how their participation has helped to make change in society?
So one thing that we haven't talked about is the power of social media. And young people, again, have the opportunity or possibility of engaging their peers through social media. And I think there's certain young leaders who have been very savvy in reaching broad audiences and inspiring them to vote. So I think that's one thing to consider. I also saw a question in the chat about schools, and I think there are some opportunities and some discussions up in Sacramento about really thinking through our civics curriculum and making it more engaging so that young people have a better understanding of how elections and the participation in between elections can really influence their everyday lives. So I think those are potential positive developments.
And Eric, as a researcher with PPIC, can you talk about, what you're seeing in terms of more representation in California's voter rolls? And, I know that the study that came out showed that there were smaller increases than hoped for. So can you elaborate on some of that and those findings?
Yeah, well, so what Mindy Romero's organization found was not that there wasn't, as you've kind of pointed out, not that there wasn't an increase in participation for those groups in 2020, but it didn't match their growth in the population. And I think that's kind of the main takeaway is that when you're thinking about the representativeness of the electorate, you have to think about how California's electorate is also changing, because it's changing very fast. And it's becoming more diverse very fast, faster than in the rest of the country. So we're going to reach a point where California is a more diverse electorate. It's just whether it's going to be diverse enough, right? And I think that's the thing that concerns a lot of people and is important to think about. One point that I wanted to make, touching on what Veronica said, about civics education, and that I actually think ties back into the pre-registration thing that she said earlier. There actually is a study that found that pre-registration increased turnout. But what was interesting about the study is the way it was set up. It essentially was showing not even so much pre-registration, but that the act of going into high schools and engaging kids in the high schools about registration and the registration process was what really got them excited and sort of engaged them in a way that they hadn't been engaged before. So it's getting back into that, the mobilization, the communication, the connection, the touch points in between elections that people have been talking about. That's so important to really create that sense of connection to the world of politics and elections.
And now, as we come to the end of this really interesting discussion, I want to step back a little bit and talk about some watershed moments in California history. We've had some really great historical points from Jane. I want to talk about moments in history which have impacted California voting. And Francisco, I'd like to start with you. Prop 187 marked a turning point in California history, and that's something you've noted. It's a prop that turned into a podcast at the LA Times 25 years later. Can you explain, well, first of all, to people that aren't familiar with it, what was Prop 187 and how did it shape voter turnout for years to come?
Sure. Prop 187 was on the ballot in 1994, and it was a proposition that about 60% of Californian voters supported. And what it did in really the broadest terms, it denied undocumented immigrants state-funded services. So this was exclusions from public education and non-emergency healthcare kinds of services. But the other thing that was particularly onerous about it was that it called on public officials, including everyday bureaucrats, to report, identify, and report to immigration officials people's immigration status. And that was meant to facilitate immigration authorities' operations to remove individuals from the US. I think this is one of the really neat, and by neat, I mean clear-cut examples of how policy can shape future politics. We know a tremendous deal now about how mobilizing that particular policy, Proposition 187 was for the Latino community. We have evidence, for example, that says individuals who might otherwise have stayed home and not registered at all really became motivated to become naturalized, therefore eligible to register, signed up, and then actually turned out to vote. And there's some really neat comparisons between individuals who look a lot like such individuals in California to those their counterparts in other states where comparable policies weren't passed. And we saw that that did have a mobilizing effect. On the other hand, it also meant that there was a clear partisan implication for this, and trends that folks had been documenting suggesting that there might be some partisan tendencies among a slice of the Latino electorate to support the GOP, who happened to be associated with officials that were connected, linked, and had come out publicly in favor of Proposition 187, that those trends began to be reversed in large measure because that was not just a mobilizing event, but it was a teaching moment, an introduction, some say even a baptism, right, into politics. And that had implications not just for their own orientations and motivations, but also what they left for the next generation and the generation after that. And so we call this Prop 187 moment a watershed moment because it's an example of how policy in yesteryear has echoes and legacies that we feel today.
Yeah, that's very fascinating. I mean, it really did shift the state's political identity for years to come, and change the way that the people think about California and where it leans politically. Jane, I want to come to you to talk about federal legislation on immigration policies and what kinds of moments you've seen, particularly with the INA in 1965, that's the Immigration and Nationality Act, the Immigration Reform and Control Act of 1986, and the if you could talk about other important moments that have really shaped voters.
Right, and I think the reason to talk about these and to raise them is because, of course, it's the federal government only that can decide who gets to enter and who gets to stay. So entry and abode policies are federal government policies only, and this is, of course, established during the era of Asian exclusion, Chinese exclusion in particular in California. So the reason to think about it is because it looks to me like we're approaching a point, if not in this administration, but relatively soon, where we're going to have some comprehensive immigration reform. And whenever we do that, it changes the landscape of the voting population. So I'll just give you the example of the 65 INA. It's the reason I'm here. It's the reason probably many of the people in your audience are here. And that's because it opens up immigration in 1965, once it was closed in essence with the National Origins Act of 1924. During this whole period of time, from Asian exclusion until my father arrives in this country in 1953, Asians could not become naturalized citizens. It's only after the McCarran-Walter Act that that's allowed. So for 80 years, Asians are the only racialized group who are excluded from citizenship. Now that's important not only for just the Asian American population more generally, but for us to think about the 65 Act. When the 1965 Act, nobody thought, go read it's very interesting. Like when you, LBJ is sitting at the base of the Statue of Liberty. He's like, I'm going to sign this thing. Doesn't really matter. This is voting rights thing. This, that thing's really controversial. But this INA doesn't mean anything. Won't change anything. Because the idea at that point was they were looking to Europe, thinking we're going to let the Italians and the Irish and all the people who had been excluded during this interwar period to finally come into the United States. They didn't think about Latin America. They didn't think about Africa. They didn't think about Asia, because for so long, we had excluded people from all of those countries on the basis of race. And once INA happened, everybody came. And that is the first time, by the way, that we have a North American immigration policy. Prior to that, you don't have like the southern border being the border that's being crossed and one being illegal, therefore, as crossing it. We still have the northern border too. Let's not forget about Canada. So my point here is that immigration policy, federal policy, will tell you everything about what your electorate's going to look like in 20 or 30 years. So the way immigration policy goes in 2022, 24 will tell you what the electorate will look like 30 years from now.
we have a lot to pay attention to in the year ahead. We're coming to a close. We have a few more minutes. Do Eric, Shakirah, or Veronica have anything to add before we move on to some great audience questions about moments in history that impacted the vote?
Yeah, if it's okay to jump in, Sonia,
Please.
I did want to talk about kind of this ugly part of California's history when it comes to Black suffrage. So in 1870, actually, California was one of the few states that did not pass the 15th Amendment, which would have extended civil protections and legal protections to people in the United States that would allow those protections and not preclude them based on their being firmly enslaved or based on their race or color. And this question was sent to all the states, and we need 2/3 to pass for the country at that time. And for years, you had lots of Black folks in California organizing, petitioning, working super hard to get this passed. And it was one of the few, amendments that came out of during Reconstruction, which really would have shaped the experience of folks and a way of reparations. And both houses, so California Assembly and Senate, said no. They blocked it. And we think of California as this like liberal progressive place, but like there are a lot of times in which, we had these forms of policy violence that really upheld white supremacy. And not only was it an anti-Black vote, it was also leveraged to block the rights of our growing Chinese community, which had really built up in the West Coast, and also our Mexican and Latino community at the time throughout California. So, which is why I'm always a big fan of moments in history where you see these moments of multicultural, multi-ethnic organizing, because that is what you really need to undo some of these issues. And that moment in California history is not really talked about or taught. But we did have issues when it came to Black suffrage here, and it's important to recognize that because it does have an impact on whose issues, priorities, needs are prioritized, solved for years to come.
Yeah, it's crucial to remember those moments and how they impacted so many voters and the state. Eric, I saw you had your hand up as well.
Yeah, I just wanted to feed off of what Jane was saying about immigration policy and just note that if we pass comprehensive immigration reform right now, it could potentially, so right now the pathway they're talking about is 8 years, but it could make a big difference in the electorate as it stands right now in California, in the sense that, so I was just running some numbers, and it's like possibly as much as a quarter, a third of the unregistered population in California is undocumented. So that's a community of people who can currently, under current law, can never be mobilized, can never be registered to vote, can never participate. And the undocumented population in California has on average been in the state for quite a long time, and been in the country for quite a long time. So they're parts of they're an embedded part of their communities. So it really is, if you're gonna, like, that would actually move the needle quite a bit by itself in terms of expanding the electorate and bringing the electorate closer to the total population.
Yeah, that's really interesting, and I'm going to keep a close eye on what happens. I mean, it's quite exciting to see what kind of changes can and may be made. I want to move to some audience questions. We had one early on from someone who asked, have you found any correlation between the number of props or initiatives on a ballot and the turnout? I often feel really overwhelmed myself when I get a giant ballot full of information, pros and cons. And do you feel that that is impacting the number of people that turn out?
I did look at that at one point, and there is a relationship. Yeah, so more ballot initiatives do tend to draw. It's not big, but it does tend to draw a few more people into voting if there's more stuff to vote on.
Okay, and Francisco?
Yeah, and then I'll just add, in addition to quantity, another thing that we know is that the propositions that are on the ballot, they tend to cue and lead us to think about politics in particular ways that has consequences for how we vote on other parts of the ballot. So it's not just the number, but it's also the consequence of shaping what we bring into the ballot or to the voting booth.
Right. Yeah, those are important considerations to make. You know, another thing is where polling places are. You know, for one commenter, he said in New York City, polling places are always public schools. You know, and it's easy for them to know where to go. And in the case of this audience member, their parents always took them to vote because it was at a public school, and it turned them into a lifelong voter. So, you know, can there be initiatives like this in California where there's always a polling place at a school or at the same place that's very easy to access? And do you think, perhaps Veronica, do you think that youth can become more engaged if polling places are at schools or places where they tend to go to as young people?
I think it would be great if high schools became polling locations. And in 2018, there were some early voting events where young people went to certain high schools to vote, and there was a large, there were some events and music and games for the young people, and I think that helped increase turnout. So I think having polling places at high schools would potentially help increase the youth vote.
And Shakirah, would you like to add something too?
I mean, you know, I would agree that we need to make sure that voting places are in senior centers. I think we should put polling places at bakeries. Like, I put them everywhere. Go where the people are. Grocery stores. You know, I'm not the expert on that piece, but I do think, you know, socialized voting in a way where people already are and showing up. But I feel like I want voting day to be a national holiday. I want everybody to have the day off. I want everyone to have the day off and be able to exercise a civic duty without having to make that, as Francisco said earlier, like, do I pick up another shift or do I spend time doing this? And it shouldn't be a Sophie's choice, particularly for our folks who are our workers, folks who need to take care of their kids, folks who are homebound. I mean, we should figure out a way to make it so voting day itself is a holiday. It's celebrated, people are protected, and people have easy access that's free to get to the polls, and their civil right is upheld.
Yeah,
that's my dream. Maybe that'll be a watershed moment in California history.
Yeah, we'll be talking about that in the next, 100 years about different polling places. You know, I think it was fascinating how so many absentee voters were able to vote without going to the polls. You know, I was an absentee voter this year, and it was amazing to see how many people were able to turn out through the mail virtually, just put it in the blue box or drop it off at City Hall. But this has been a really stimulating discussion. Thank you to all of you for participating and sharing your insights. Maybe in 4 years, there will be a bakery in San Francisco that I will drop my ballot. Shakirah, thank you for that idea. To follow up with any of the panelists, I urge you to email California Humanities Program Coordinator. That is Kirsten Vega. She's put her email in the chat box. It's K like King Vega at calhum.org. So please send any follow-up questions to Kirsten, and she will direct them to our amazing, talented group of experts that we thank so much for spending an hour of your busy day with us. Thank you so much to the audience for being with us. It was truly a pleasure to moderate and to speak to all of you. Thank you all. Thank you. Take care.